Good afternoon. This is Gloria Nelson with TUG, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's TUG Connects 365 webinar. Before we get started, and as you settle in and get ready for the start of today's webinar, let me give you a brief introduction for TUG, the usergroup.org, for both our current members and for those of you who represent organizations that have not yet joined our online community of Infor distribution software users. We've all heard the phrase knowledge is power, and I can say with confidence that after today's presentation, you'll be waking up tomorrow with a little more of both. But today is only one presentation. TUG webinars, online forums, and member events facilitate the timely exchange of ideas and information to help you work smarter and with more confidence. That is a powerful combination. And if you're currently a member, it pays to get more involved. And if you're not, please visit our website to discover why 2,300 heads are better than one to help you be the best at what you can do. So without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to present this afternoon's webinar with David Garcia, and he's going to be giving you progress on 4GL Q&D Level 1 content. David, I'm going to make you presenter. Give me just a moment. I'll let you know when your screen is in view.
Okay.
And go ahead and take it away.
Okay. Welcome everybody to my presentation of quick and dirty programming in 4GL. My name is David Garcia. I am the IT application supervisor at First Supply. My background is in development with 20 years of IT experience with progress, both in character and in web UI. We are running an on-prem web UI solution since 2018, currently at 20.4, that we update 2 to 3 times a year. Prior to living in the web UI world, my prior roughly 17 years of experience was in a character environment that I was involved with writing quite a bit of code for, whether it's Q&Ds, whether it's new programs for reports, as well as new modules. So to start off this presentation, I'm going to put this disclaimer up. This webinar presentation contains information that may be considered confidential in your organization, and access to some of this information could cause damage to your data. We are talking about Q&Ds, so we are accessing the data if proper precautions are not taken. None of this information should be considered an endorsement or recommendation of any kind, and the presenter and TUG take no responsibility for how this information is used by you. Since we are getting into coding and access to the database, making you aware that if you do want to build experience in what you are doing before you just start running the code. Important fact number one, please do all of your development in a test environment. This relates directly back to the previous slide. Even the quickest and simplest change should be, in my opinion, performed in a test environment first. You think you wrote the code to execute it successfully, and it'll backfire if you didn't test it out first. My important fact number 2, from a coding standpoint, my opinion is there is no single right way to write these programs. I feel there are better ways and there are worse ways, but ultimately, when you're coding something, there's going to be various different ways of whether it's structuring the program, whether it's you call one table before another, or whether you're using different coding capabilities within Progress. Each one has its potential benefits and drawbacks. And so your program takes 2 minutes to run instead of 30 seconds. Well, one might be better than the other, but both are equally effective at getting the data you're looking for. So outline of topics that I intend to touch on in this intro to 4GL development. First topic I'm going to be touching on is our data dictionary. We'll talk a little bit about planning out our attack for writing our Q&D, and I will be pulling up an editor at that point, and we will actually be writing a Q&D for a scenario that is brought up in my slideshow. So we will be covering different statements, primary structures within Progress 4GL for eaches and find statements. We'll discuss record locking, and we'll also discuss the means of getting output, whether it's outputting it to the screen or actually generating it out to an output file for you to use in other means. After that, we will touch on some variables and using variables within the programs, and we will have some time at the end for questions, puzzles, or otherwise that users may want to address or inquire about. We'll pause as well in a few locations throughout this process if you have questions as well. So first off, we're going to do a poll. Gloria, if you could pull up that poll.
Yeah, the poll question is, what is your level of experience in Progress 4GL? Select one of the following. What's Progress 4GL? Seen a few Q&Ds, never written Progress 4GL code, written simple Q&Ds in progress, less than a year of coding, written multiple Q&Ds, 1 to 3 years of coding, written entirely new interfaces for SX.e and 3+ years. So we're looking at the population of the audience right now. We're going to give it a few more minutes, David.
And so while you're filling out that questionnaire, my background with writing some Q&Ds, there's been a few that have been useful for me that was going to touch on while people have a chance to fill that out and while we wait for the numbers to come in. We do a test system refresh in our web UI environment. We try to do it every 3 to 4 months. And as a part of that refresh, we have a handful of Q&Ds that actually, after we do a refresh of a backup from the production system and restore it into our test environment. The Q&Ds actually are configured to identify a number of fields that need to be adjusted properly to make it the test system and not the production system. You really don't want it pointing at production endpoints. The other good example I have of a fun Q&D that I wrote was that as we were going live with web UI, we had some, before we were single sign-on, we had users that needed to get into the test environment to train, and they couldn't remember, nobody could remember what their passwords were from 2 months earlier when we refreshed. So I wrote a Q&D that reset all of their passwords so that they could actually get into their test system effectively. One of my coworkers said, after finding out I wrote that, he's like, I knew you're good at programming before, but now I know you're dangerous. When you're writing updates like that, yes, you can be dangerous.
And here's the shared results with regard to level of experience in our viewing attendees this afternoon. 20% want to know what's Progress 4GL. 31% have seen a few Q&Ds but never written code before. 22% have written simple Q&Ds, less than a year of coding. 24% have 1 to 3 years of coding experience, and 4% have written entirely new interfaces. So that gives you a good concept of who's online and watching today, David. So I'm going to go ahead and hide those results and let you continue on.
Okay, so I heard 30%, 20%. I didn't catch the middle number.
20% didn't know what Progress 4GL was. 31% have seen few but have never written. 22% have done simple Q&Ds with less than a year experience, and 24% have 1 to 3 years of experience.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
So For the what is progress 4GL, the backend code of the interface for SX.e and WebUI is all written in a proprietary language that is related to the database, the progress database. It's a pretty handy language to learn. It has both similarities and differences to SQL. Both of them are pretty powerful. With my many years of working in progress, I think I have a little bit of a favorite there. But so as we get into development, one of the first things that we want to be able to have access to for SX.e is, it helps to have my focus on, is access to a data dictionary for the database. Within the data dictionary, I personally have two options. One is having access to SX Architect through Infor, and the other choice is directly in an editor. Now, when you're doing it within an editor, I have the following several slides that cover how you would actually run a report to generate a data dictionary report file for a specific table. It comes in particularly handy because it is the current version of the data dictionary for the table that you are looking at. So you'd end up going up to I always work in a character editor, data dictionary. Once you're in the data dictionary, you go to reports. Once you're in reports, you can select detailed table. You go and find the table in the drop-down list, or you type in the name. After that, I always output it to a file in my home directory. In this case, you can see I'm outputting the OEH to a data dictionary, a dd-OEH txt file. It's my naming convention that I use for any output of a data dictionary report file. And then I always also output it, actually I would change it to alphabetically based on the field names. And then I have to remember, you always want to go to exit to output. Let me show one thing real quick. When it generates an output, here is the output that it generates. I'm hoping you can see my screen with the data dictionary text file.
Yes, can see it in clear view.
Okay, so it lists all the fields, it lists all the triggers, it lists all the fields in alphabetical order based on the identifier or the type of field it is. These reports can be rather lengthy. It identifies the formats. It identifies default field values. And I keep scrolling down, and there's the labels. Labels are pretty handy when you're trying to figure out what it is on the screen, what's the field name for that field on the actual table. And way down at the bottom, we have indexes. We want to make sure that in terms of progress, when we're going to go and retrieve records, we want to know what the indexes are. And we'll definitely be revisiting the topic of indexes again and again throughout this discussion. So let me bring my mouse back. So taking a pause from touching on data dictionary to see if there are any immediate questions with data dictionary or starting off.
We do have a couple of questions. The first question is, can you recommend which data dictionary approach to use?
So each one does have its advantages. With the data dictionary for within SX Architect, they do give all of the many different choices, and it really is handy to have an SX Architect login. Within their interface, you can go straight into their layout and have drill downs into the indexes. It's pretty handy in that respect. SX Architect also brings other useful tools with being able to view code for different versions. So I really prefer to work with the Architect version. It keeps me out of being in the actual data dictionary where you can technically cause trouble in there. If there's ever a scenario where you're not seeing quite the right version of the schema, going to the data dictionary directly in the application itself can get you the unequivocal answer of whether that field is there or not.
Okay.
You said there was a second question?
Lots of questions are just flooding in right now. You may have mentioned this already, but what is the purpose of exporting this? Is this needed if you don't have access to the SX data dictionary tool?
Exporting as in writing it to a file. I write it to a file. If you're executing the data dictionary directly within the editor, I export it to a file because invariably, if I use it once or if it's a commonly used table, I'll export it. I'll want to be able to refer to it again in future Q&Ds. So having a subdirectory that you might have some of those readily available for the version you're working in can be kind of handy, as opposed to constantly going back in there and looking up indexes or fields.
And that leads us to the next question, was the very first screen that you launched on, that you went through and scrolled down through, that showed the fields, that showed the labels, the tags, etc. We had someone post and said, how did you actually get to that screen? So
we're talking this screen, I assume?
Yes, correct. That's
so when, let's go back in the slide. After selecting, so each of these screenshots are in chronological order. So I went up to the menu in the editor, select data dictionary, and selected reports. Once you're in that, this next interface says, okay, which type of report are we looking for? And I did detailed table. I selected the table and I told it to output to a file, which it would output into a directory on the database server that your editor is being run on in the first place. I ended up using an FTP process like FileZilla to go and grab that file to pull it to my local computer, so that I had it copied on my computer so that I could open it in Notepad++.
Okay, and a couple of people have asked, how do I get to the progress editor?
So within our environment, we are running in a Linux environment. There are commands likely on that box to pull up an editor. If you have not accessed that before, you may want to either work with a Infor individual to make sure the scripts are there to actually pull it up. They would help identify which command. It may all depend on what version you're running to identify what script would be used to pull up that editor interface. There's also, I think, a GUI choice, but I don't personally use that. Okay.
The actual poster said, got it, thank you. So props to you. Another question is the SX Architect, that's a tongue twister, available in all SX installs, or is it an extra feature?
So that was a website that you have to work with Infor to gain access to. I can't speak to costs or otherwise for obtaining the rights to access and use that. You would have to follow up with your Infor rep.
Okay. Going back to the editor, one of the posters said, you're saying in editor, when you're in editor mode, I'm assuming, and the poster said, what is that?
So we will be pulling up an editor in a few minutes, and I will show you actually, I have an editor right here. I'm running a putty session that when we executed a particular shell script in shell command in our environment, pulls up this editor program interface that you literally use to type your programs. Display, hello world. There's our first program. Our first, it has a bunch of functionality, like you can do a syntax check to make sure your code works properly. It's connected directly to the database so that as you're building the programs, it's able to validate that both the syntax is right. The fields, if you're not naming a field properly in your code, it's going to tell you it's wrong. And for Q&D purposes, this would be one of those types of interfaces where you pull up the program and you can actually run it in real time directly through this interface.
Yeah, and one of the people that's online, actually, that's part of the viewing attendee audience, says reports are available by running MB Pro and the path to your database. And for those who might not be TUG members and are here at the invitation of someone else within the Infor family of users, I just want to point out to you that this kind of integrated response from someone who is working in this format every day is part of the community of users in our group, and just how quickly we get responses back on operation conundrums that can pop up during the course of the day. So that concludes our questions. I'm going to turn my camera off for another moment and I'll jump back on when you're ready next, okay? Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, David.
So I appreciate the feedback on the MB Pro command for executing it, for pulling up an editor. And I will always refer back to our disclaimer that always be careful when you are coding, because it has the potential to wreak havoc if you're not careful. So for today's puzzle, with our intro, I thought I'd toss out today's puzzle of we're going to actually pull up an editor and build a Q&D that provides an answer to the question. So today's question is, can you tell me the number of orders each warehouse has in the pick stage in SX.e? This has some assumptions of what are we looking for? It assumes we know what pick stage means. It assumes we know where warehouses are stored and where orders are stored. As you build more experience with writing Q&Ds, you'll start automatically recognizing which tables they're talking about. It just takes some time to get used to the naming conventions. And obviously with this question, let's pull up my editor. So where is my editor? There's my editor. So I'm trying to adjust my other screen so that I can have, did not want to pop that back up there. So can you tell me the number of orders in each warehouse has in the pick stage in SX.e? So within the Progress 4GL, the two primary commands that are used to retrieve records from the database are commands that are called a for each statement and a find statement. So a for each statement, from an English standpoint, is pretty straightforward in that the for each implies that it is going to be looping through records. It's going to be looping through a lot of records. So for each, the table for orders is OEH, where OEH. Now we want to find all of the orders in the pick stage. Now I'm going to type up real quick the start of this Q&D for retrieving those records. and OEH stage code equals 2. No luck. Now, with the for each, it's going to loop through and find all the records that are for Kono, which is company number 1, and stage code equals number 2. And it's going to do everything between this colon and the end statement. It's going to loop through and do, in which case we'll do display order no. Let's do and order stuff. Now, I mentioned good ways to do things and bad ways to do things. When I'm coding, one, I always do this through the indent process because it makes it easier to read, to know for eaches, everything within those brackets is going to be looped through. The other thing I will always do is any field from a database table, I will always prefix with the table name. It helps if you get into developing with using variables to keep track of which values are variables, which values are fields on a table. It also helps keep it clear for if you have the same field being identified on 2 different tables. If you're looking for order no or displaying order no or even setting it, you want to make sure you're specifying specifically the table that is being adjusted. Now, if I run this right now, well, I'll syntax check it. Syntax is correct. If I run it right now, it takes some time and I'm hitting spacebar, and then now it's taking a nice long time to try to figure out what it's going to do. Well, now I mentioned indexing before. When we get into indexing, let's go and pull up that. At the bottom of the data dictionary are indexes on each of the tables. These help you retrieve records as efficiently as possible. And so whenever I'm building a query to retrieve records, I'm going to try to structure that for each statement to mirror the sequence of fields in any index as closely as humanly possible. So in this case, we didn't have one that was just Kono and then stage code as we look through. We've got either Kono warehouse stage code, or we have Kono Custno stage code. So I don't have any one of them that helps immediately to retrieve the records. So as you saw when I was outputting it, it's using its primary index to retrieve records. So it's going to go through the entire table looking at records and say, is this stage 2? Is this stage 2? And work its way slowly through the entire table to try to find those records. The advantage of using an index directly in the same sequence, so the next field was OEH warehouse. I'll just hard code this briefly to our MAD warehouse. If syntax check, everything's good, and it goes directly there and shows and gets them immediately. The indexes take you directly to the records and find them in rather very rapidly. Oh, I wanted to keep that there. Equals MAD. Now, but I wanted to know the orders that exist in all warehouses. So I'm going to loop through all of the warehouses. So for each ICSD is the warehouse table. No luck. Oh. From that, now housekeeping for me says, this is now, we want to go and find each warehouse. And then within each warehouse, we want to see how many orders or what orders are in stage 2. So because it's now inside of the ICSD for each loop, we can now reference that field to find all of the orders. Syntax check, no lock, no lock. And actually, let's output to warehouse. So it started off in our Appleton warehouse. It switches to our next warehouse, and it'll fly through the entire list in rather rapid succession. Questions so far?
We do have one that populated.
Okay.
Can this be used for Cloud Suite distribution?
So your database lives on likely a Linux box, in which case you would have an editor. Well, you said Cloud Suite specifically, not on an on-premise solution. In Cloud Suite, that is not an option. It is only an option for on-premise solutions.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, but no.
No worries. Better to have a definitive answer than a definite maybe. So I'm going to switch off my camera and let you jump back into your program.
Okay. So let me pause real quick. Now, notice one of the things that I took, well, before I get to no locks, the other statement type that was mentioned was finds. So for each is our loops through each of the content, each of the records that meet the criteria. A find statement is another option for retrieving records that Progress provides, in which it's going to go and find a record that meets the criteria. So say we wanted to find the customer, we could, for this particular order, we could tell it to find ARSC where ARSC Kono equals the orders Kono, and ARSC Custno equals OEH Custno, and no lock, no error. Now, so the two means of retrieving records, one that iterates through each of the records and one that goes and finds the single record that meets the criteria, and I have a typo. So in each of these, notice that I'm putting a no lock statement. No lock is the manner in which you're locking the records when you're retrieving from the database. Progress allows for 3 different types of locks. There are no locks, there are share locks, and there are exclusive locks. As a programmer, I only have ever used no locks and exclusive locks. I never use share locks, in that if I'm going to be locking a record, then I'm going to explicitly write within a program to say, at this moment in time, I'm going to be updating that record, so I'm going to lock it right now. For the most part, all of the discussion today, we aren't going to be locking any records or updating any records for fields. So in all instances, when we are retrieving records, we should explicitly identify no lock. If you forget to put no locks on your statements, it is automatically implied to be a share lock, and then you may have unexpected behaviors if you are performing some tasks that, like you think you're assigning a variable, but you named something inaccurately, and you're not assigning the variable, you're assigning the field of the database, and oops, you didn't lock the table. And hence back to our disclaimer. You can't, if you are doing this, you want to be very careful and you can damage the data if you're not writing programs effectively.
David, I have a quick question. Being
okay.
somebody who doesn't live in this, and I'm just looking and listening through a different litmus test myself, one of the things that I do when I have to work in a new software program and given a new set of assignments here, for example, in managing Salesforce and being new to that platform, I get myself a cheat sheet of how-to instructions and put literally a 3M Post-it note on my second monitor so that I have it as a resource of things to, it's kind of like stop, look, and listen. Is there anything that you can provide as safeguards with regard to step 1, 2, 3 of things that you have to do to checkpoint so that you don't put yourself in harm's way and corrupt your data?
Checkpoint 1, work in a test environment. Checkpoint 2, always use no lock until you are prepared to experienced enough developer to be working in a process where you would actually be updating records back to the database. I feel building that experience with just writing the queries first and foremost is step A.
Okay, and I have a couple questions that floated in here also.
Okay.
After we came back live that might be relevant. What is your feeling of using SQL versus 4GL to count and find records?
So again, I'm biased in that I am more used to progress than I am with SQL queries. Invariably, part of one of my thoughts on that is the fact that they will ask for one bit of data and they'll ask for counts, and then they'll actually want that. Now we don't just want counts, we want a list of the orders, and we want to know who the sales rep is. And so as those continue to creep up, I end up favoring going directly to the source of working with progress. I'm less concerned about the integration of working from a progress editor of making these queries versus through an ODBC or JDBC connection to the database.
Okay, and we had two people. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step over you. I apologize.
Go ahead. You're fine.
Two people asked, is Progress 4GL case sensitive?
No, it is not. Yeah, if I type in O, it still recognizes. It is also not case sensitive. Like if you are working and making queries to your to the database itself, SX.e itself is not case sensitive for capital letters versus lowercase letters. So short answer, no, it is not.
Okay, great. And then another question is, what are the keystrokes to check syntax?
Within this editor, it's pressing the escape and then the P button executes the syntax check. There's a whole bunch of, if I went up to the menu screen and we pulled some of them down, let's see, escape M takes me up to the menu. There's all these escape choices. So syntax check, escape P. It's a lot easier than going up to the menu each time and pressing and selecting it.
Great.
Okay.
So that's our question so far. So I'm going to tune out and I'll jump back in at your next break. Thanks, David.
Okay. So in our scope creep instance today, they didn't just want to count. They want to know about orders, how long the orders have been sitting there. At a certain level, it becomes less of a instance where we are looking for just a straight count, but we want to know, we want to just have a list of those orders that are the troublemakers that they want to know about. So let's go back to our editor. So once we start getting into that realm, we start getting into how do we get this to output? Because right now we have, if I, syntax check, if I run the display, right now all I'm doing is getting this to a screen. Well, that's not going to be very handy for your purposes of providing this list of orders to users. So Progress has, by default, the display output is to the screen. Progress allows for up to 5 streams of output. And it's actually pretty straightforward to define a stream for output. We define a stream. We output stream S1 is just the naming convention I used to define what that stream is going to be referred to. It's like a variable name, but defining a stream output. Home, D Garcia, QD, TUG. This is just the directory I'm going to write it out to, and I'm going to output let's call it QD OEH orders in the text file. So we defined that stream. We don't have to replace this display. We could do a new display statement. Display OEH or stream S1 OEH warehouse OEH order no OEH order stuff and OEH enter date, because they wanted to know how long the orders have been sitting there. Okay, we'll do a quick syntax check. Oh. Define output stream S1 to, helps to have my syntax right. So we have now, one is going to show our list of orders to the screen, but at the same time, it's also going to write that output to this secondary stream that has those fields in it. And syntax check. Oh, because I have 2 display statements, it is displaying them one at a time. So display statements can also have variable name or names as well with frame F1. I'm gonna say don't pause between each one, and syntax check, fire in the hole, and that's how quickly it flew through all of those records from all of our different warehouses. So if I open up that file, qd oeh orders.txt, here's that very same thing that we saw on the screen flying by with the added column of enter date. Now, with it being in separate columns, that's just a text file report, which is one format that we can use to output to a file and pull into, say, Excel and count those up. There are options where we could instead format it in a manner that is more conducive to outputting to Excel, in which case you might want to delimit those fields in some way to help identify, to break it up so that Excel is more readily able to pull it in and you're not jumping through as much of a wizard to open up the file. My one choice I generally do for those, when we're putting it out there in a manner for Excel to be able to consume, we have to actually do a slightly different command. I do unformatted because I don't want it truncating the fields off. And I like tab delimited, which uses a delimiter between each field.
And David, while you're inputting that information, right before we transition, it kind of like got caught right at the end of that second bank of questions. Someone posted and said, what is no error for?
Okay, so that's right. Syntax check real quick. So when you're doing a find on, it's a very good question. So within for eaches, you're doing a loop between the colon and the end, and it says, for all the records that meet this criteria, do all this stuff that's in the middle. With finds, it's not a block of code that says, for all the records that you find, do this. It is, go and find this record. Well, what happens if that record doesn't actually exist? If it doesn't exist, this find statement will come back and say, I couldn't find anything, and I'm going to shoot a project progress error to the output to say, I couldn't find it. Well, for our programming and for our output, we don't want that error message to show up when it doesn't find it. A find message could also error if there is more than one record that meets the criteria. So by putting no error, it suppresses that error message from showing up on the screen. You can do subsequent logic to say, if available ARSC, then do, like, if we wanted to display to some other piece of some other piece of output, we can do a little other subroutine inside the ARSC, inside this if available. But no error helps make sure that you're not generating all sorts of error messages to your output if it doesn't find a record. That was a very good question. So I updated the second stream, or the stream that we're putting out to a file. This CHR009 is actually a tab character. So I'm tab delimiting each of these fields to say, put warehouse tab, order no tab, order suffix, and then enter date, and then put a return character. So it'll put a line, fire in the hole. QD OEH order no orders txt. So now everything is in a tab delimited format, separating each of the fields that if we were to pull into Excel, makes it pretty easy to import. At which point then users are, it's a lot less confusing for users if something's coming out, if they're planning to pull it into Excel that way. So effect. Now, I think the last topic I had was on variables. Variable declarations. One of the nice things I like about Progress is that you can just declare variables. So define variable vcount as integer. No undo. If you don't put the no undo, progress tries to keep track of previous values of what that variable was in a nutshell. Basically, every time I ever declare a variable, I do no undo because I'm not going to be worried about what earlier values were or reverting it to earlier values. In general, every variable declaration is no undo. So we have variable declaration. At the beginning of each warehouse, I'll say vcount equals 1. Actually 0. So vcount will be reset at the beginning of each warehouse. As we grab an order, vcount equals vcount plus 1. So we will iterate that count after each record that we find. We will add it to the output. So each line in that tab delimited output will show that count, or what that record number is. Now, count, display vcount, everything's good. In terms of naming conventions, I always prefix my variables with a v dash because I know that within SX.e, none of the fields are ever named with that type of naming convention. So it's a safety measure from my perspective that variable names have a particular format, that stream names have very particular format, that if when we get into temp table definitions at some point, those have a particular format of naming conventions. If you're going to get into more heavy development, you'll want to establish those naming conventions, and I'm always willing to provide recommendations if you so desire. So if I fire this
David,
off.
I was just going to say,
Yep.
we're coming up quickly to the top of the hour and have a couple of questions that are populating. Number one, I wanted to let people know that today's session is being recorded. It will be available on the next business day for viewing if you want to take and revisit any of the content. And another question is you're talking about the data that you're retrieving. If I want to open files in Excel, do you have a recommended output format?
I do tend to favor a tab delimited versus a comma separated format. Those are pretty much the two most common formats that I see for how one would generate those files. I tend towards the tab delimited in that tabs are generally not something that you would find in a data field anywhere ever in SX.e, whereas commas, now you're jumping through hoops of do you put quotes around fields, and how do you differentiate a comma that is separating a field versus one that is content within a field. So I err on the side of simplicity and go with the tab delimited.
Okay. And one of the posts then came up is, what is the significance of using a dot and a colon with regard to commands?
So let's go back to the dot versus the colon. So the colon really, the period denotes the end of a specific statement. So whether it's I'm defining this variable, this is a single statement. I'm setting that variable to 0, single statement. The colon is really defining this almost like a block of code. So with the colon, it says here's the start of this block of code that has a end statement that declares the end of that section. So if we did there's a repeat command. A repeat would have I would put a colon after, and then there would be an end that correlates to the end of that repeat. If we don't have the end, it knows that, hey, syntactically, we're missing an end statement because it knows a block started, but it's missing where it's supposed to be completed. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have one last question. Do you have a cheat sheet available to share for all the commands that they can use?
All the commands within Progress?
Yes.
So I recognize that this is a 1 hour, very quick intro to just seeing and being exposed to constructing programs in Infor GL for Q&Ds. I have a book from Progress Training from how many, 20 years ago? This is a cheat sheet of pages upon pages of different commands that are available within the Progress 4GL language. It is a language that you can build entire character and GUI interfaces that is it is a many-day course. So while I can identify a few of the basic commands, I could not near to establish a comprehensive list.
Is that course still available to the best of your knowledge, David?
I know that there are some courses that are available on, I believe there's some virtual online learning courses. I think Progress and some other consulting companies offer some training courses in it, and it ends up being a multi-day affair for the participants. If you're looking to get into it, I would definitely recommend an in-depth, some in-depth time spent with doing that, and start small. As you saw in my code, like I started off with a simple little for each statement and made sure that worked. And then I expanded to a few more commands and made sure that worked. And you're just iteratively building from the simple program to the more complex. So don't try to just build it all at once.
Understood. And another poster said, would you teach a class for updating, deleting, or inserting rows using Progress 4GL?
So we do have a session coming up in 2 weeks in which we start talking about updating records, which is going to be even more dangerous and not for the faint of heart. But it will again be a very brief 1 hour introduction to the concept of some of the techniques that I use to try to execute things as safely as possible, and some of those possibilities.
So we're going to be taking a deeper dive on Tuesday, the 28th of July at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be sending out a notice, as always, as well as publishing it on our members forum boards. It's exclusive to our members. And David, due to time and we're after the top of the hour, would you like to pop up a contact slide in terms of how somebody can get in touch with you should they have a need?
Back to my bio slide. My email is right there in green, dgarcia@onesupply.com, and feel free to shoot me questions. I will try my best to answer them.
Awesome. And I'm going to take control of the screen real quickly here. And first of all, David, thank you so very much for this great content and your expertise this afternoon. This was a very valuable presentation. And don't forget, the TUG forum boards is a great resource for our members to interact with your peers, to post questions, and get swift solutions to daily operational challenges. And as with most of our webinars, this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel no later than tomorrow, next business day. So we'd like to invite those of you who are members of the TUG organization to continue this discussion in our online communities of Cloud Suite distribution and SX.e forums to continue talking in greater depth about this content. I know that David will be there looking for any questions or comments that you have that would need his further attention. And for those of you who are not yet members, please visit us at www.theusergroup.org and join us. It'll be the best thing that you can possibly do. David, many thanks on behalf of TUG, and we look forward to your next presentation on the 28th of July. And as they say in Hollywood, that's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.